I was standing in my kitchen that morning, holding a warm cup of coffee, watching the sunlight fall gently on the floor, thinking about nothing important at all, just ordinary thoughts like what to cook later. Whether the plants needed water, silly little things, ha ha ha. Isn't it strange how life feels safest right before it breaks? When my phone buzzed on the counter, and I smiled without thinking. Because when your child's name flashes on your screen, you don't expect pain, you expect something sweet, maybe a photo, maybe a question, maybe just a hi mom. So I wiped my hands, picked it up, and then I froze. Because the words sitting there didn't feel real at first, they felt like they belonged to someone else's life, not mine, not a message meant for a mother. And I remember reading it once, then again, slower this time. My chest tightening with every word, don't expect me to take care of you in old age. I have my own life and family. I actually laughed at first, a short, confused sound, ha ha ha, because sometimes shock makes your brain do strange things, and I thought, is this a joke? Did he mean to send this to someone else? So I read it again, and then I felt it, that heavy, sinking feeling right behind the ribs, like air leaving your body all at once. And I just stood there, staring at the screen, my coffee growing cold, my hands trembling slightly. Not violently, just enough to notice, just enough to scare me, because there was no argument before this, no fight, no warning, no buildup. Nothing that explained why my own child would send something like that to me. And the question that kept circling in my mind was a quiet one, but a dangerous one. How long had he been thinking this? I sat down slowly, as if my legs had suddenly forgotten their job, and I could hear my own breathing, slow and uneven, sigh, and I thought about all the mornings I had woken up early for him, all the meals, all the rides, all the worries. All the nights spent waiting for him to come home safely, and the strangest part wasn't even the words themselves. It was how calm they were, how final, how neatly they cut me out of his future. As if I was already a problem he wanted to solve in advance, and that's when another thought crept in, one that made my throat tight. Was I supposed to beg now? Was this the moment where I explained myself, apologized for aging, promised not to be a burden, promised not to need anything, promised to disappear quietly when the time came? I imagined typing a long reply, explaining how independent I still was, how strong I felt, how I didn't need much, how I had never asked him for care in the first place. But then I stopped because something inside me whispered, why am I defending myself against something I never did? The silence in the kitchen felt louder than any argument could have been, and I realized something that made my stomach twist. This message didn't come from anger, it came from certainty. And certainty means it had been decided long before my phone buzzed that morning, and that thought hurt more than anything else, because betrayal is easier to handle when it's loud. But this was quiet, calculated, neat, and intentional. And I sat there for a long time, longer than I'd like to admit, doing nothing but breathing and listening to my own thoughts argue with each other. One voice saying, he didn't mean it like that. Another saying, yes, he did. And somewhere in between, a very tired voice asking, what happens now? My finger hovered over the screen, the reply box open, blinking patiently, waiting for me to pour my heart out like I always had. And I felt tears sting my eyes, not the dramatic kind, just the quiet kind that make you blink hard and look away. Awe, and then something unexpected happened. The tears stopped, not because the pain left, but because clarity walked in, slow and calm, and it said, if he has already decided his future doesn't include caring for you, then why are you still pretending yours should revolve around him? That thought scared me because it felt like standing at the edge of something irreversible, and yet it also felt strangely steady, like standing on solid ground after a long time at sea. And I realized this moment wasn't asking me to react, it was asking me to choose. And for the first time since my husband passed away, for the first time since my world had quietly shrunk, I understood that choosing myself didn't have to be loud, it didn't have to be cruel, it didn't even have to be emotional, it could be calm, and that calm could be powerful, so I typed just one word, okay. Nothing else, no explanation. No guilt, no tears spilled onto the screen, just that one word, and when I pressed send, my heart thudded once, hard, like it was warning me. This will change things, and I whispered to the empty kitchen, almost laughing at myself. Ha ha ha, yes, it will, because I knew deep down that people don't panic when nothing has changed. They panic when control slips, and I had a feeling, a quiet, unsettling feeling, that by not arguing, by not crying, by not begging, I had just done something my son never expected. And if you're still listening to this story right now, Sai, I want you to pause for a second and ask yourself, what would you have done if someone you loved sent you a message like that? Because stories like this don't just happen to other people. And if you want to hear how a single word led to a knock on my door the very next morning, how calm turned into panic, and how my life quietly shifted in ways even I didn't see coming, then stay with me. And if stories like this matter to you, if they make you feel seen or understood, take a second to subscribe. Because sometimes the quiet stories are the ones that change us the most. I keep thinking about how strange it is that you can live inside a story for decades and never question it, never pause to ask whether the version you believe is the truth or just the one that feels safest. Because before that message arrived, before that single sentence cracked something open inside me, I truly believed I had built a good life, not a perfect one, not a rich one, but a solid, honest one. And I believed my son was part of that foundation, not someone quietly waiting for it to collapse. And as I sat there after sending that okay, staring at the wall, sigh, my mind drifted backward. Not because I wanted to relive the past, but because I needed to understand how we got here, how a life that felt so full could lead to words that felt so empty. And I remembered the early years, the ones people love to romanticize. The tiny house, the long days, the nights where sleep came in pieces, the way my husband and I learned to stretch money, patience, and energy without ever complaining about it out loud, ha ha ha. Because when you're young, you think effort is endless. And we weren't wealthy, not even close, but we were careful, and careful felt powerful back then, paying bills on time, saving what we could, dreaming quietly instead of loudly, and when our son was born, everything shrank and expanded at the same time. Our world suddenly revolved around him, and we didn't question that either because that's what parents do. They rearrange their lives without calling it sacrifice, and years passed like that. School mornings, scraped knees, homework at the kitchen table, arguments about bedtime, laughter that filled the house in ways money never could. And I truly believed, truly, that love worked like an investment. That if you poured enough of it in early, it would grow into something stable later, something that would hold when things got hard, and even after my husband passed away. After the house felt quieter in a way that still makes my chest ache if I think about it too long, I told myself, at least I did one thing right. I raised a good son because he called, he visited, he showed up on holidays. He brought his wife, the grandchildren ran through the house, and I smiled and told myself this was how life was supposed to look at this age. Slower, softer, smaller, but still warm, and when they needed help, I helped. Not because I felt obligated, but because it felt natural, like breathing a little money here, a little there, never huge amounts, never anything that made me nervous, and every time I said yes, I told myself, this is what family does. And I didn't keep score, didn't ask questions, didn't pause to wonder why emergencies seemed to appear so often, because asking those questions felt unkind, and kindness had always been my instinct, my weakness, and my pride. But looking back now, I can see how kindness slowly turned into expectation, how generosity quietly became something they counted on instead of something they appreciated. And the signs were there, weren't they, hiding in plain sight? The way conversations shifted when money came up, the way my plans were brushed aside, the way jokes were made about when you're older, as if age itself was a burden I should apologize for, and I remember brushing those moments off. Laughing softly, ha ha ha, telling myself I was being sensitive, that I was reading too much into things, because admitting otherwise would mean facing a truth I wasn't ready for, and the hardest part to admit, even now, is that I enjoyed feeling needed, not in a desperate way, but in a quiet, reassuring way, because after my husband died, being useful made the loneliness easier to carry, and maybe that's why I didn't notice how the balance shifted. How I went from being a mother who helped to a resource that was assumed, and the more I think about it, the clearer it becomes that the text message didn't come from nowhere. It was the result of years of unspoken thinking, years of entitlement slowly forming under polite smiles and family dinners. And that realization hurts in a different way than shock, because shock fades, but recognition lingers. And I found myself asking questions I had never allowed myself to ask before. Did he ever see me as someone who might need care? Or only as someone who would provide it? Did he ever imagine a future where responsibility flowed both ways? And the silence that followed those questions was heavy, because the answers weren't comforting. And as I sat there that afternoon, memories playing in my head like old photographs, I understood something that felt both sad and freeing. Love doesn't always disappear. Sometimes it just changes shape, and sometimes the version you're holding onto isn't the one the other person has anymore. And realizing that doesn't make you heartless, it makes you honest, and honesty can be painful, but it's also the beginning of clarity, and clarity was starting to form whether I was ready or not, and I could feel it pressing forward, asking me to look closer, to stop assuming, to stop filling in gaps with hope. And as much as part of me wanted to cling to the past, to the version of my son I raised, another part of me whispered, you can't protect a memory at the cost of your future. And that whisper wouldn't leave me alone, because something had shifted, something irreversible, and even though nothing dramatic had happened yet, even though the house was still quiet and the day looked ordinary from the outside, I could sense it, that this story wasn't about what had already happened, but about what was coming next. And if the past was built on trust I never questioned, the next chapter was going to demand something different from me, something braver, something I had avoided my whole life. And the question that stayed with me as the sun began to set was simple but unsettling. If the life I believed in wasn't as solid as I thought, what else had I been refusing to see? There's a moment when doubt stops feeling like imagination and starts feeling like memory rearranging itself. And that's exactly what happened to me a few months before that text ever arrived, though I didn't know it yet. Didn't have the courage to name it yet, and I remember the phone call clearly because it sounded so ordinary. My son's voice slightly rushed, slightly strained, the kind of tone that immediately puts a mother on alert. And he said there was a medical emergency, that they needed help, that insurance hadn't covered everything. And without even asking how much, my mouth said yes before my mind could catch up, because that's what mothers do. Sigh, we don't ask for proof when someone we love sounds scared, and I transferred the money the next day, telling myself it was temporary, telling myself I was lucky to even be able to help, telling myself all the comforting lies people use when they don't want to slow down and look closely. And for a while, everything felt normal again: dinners, smiles, the children running through my living room like nothing in the world could ever go wrong. And then one small moment cracked the surface, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to let something dark seep through. Because at the next family gathering, I casually asked how the recovery was going, said it lightly, kindly, expecting a tired but grateful answer, and instead I saw confusion flicker across his wife's face just for a second. But long enough for my stomach to tighten, and she said, "Recovery from what?" And that was it. That was the moment, ha ha ha, not because of the words, but because of how fast my son jumped in, talking over her, correcting me, smoothing things out with a story that didn't quite fit. And I nodded, smiled, played along, because that's what we do when we don't want to cause a scene. But something inside me shifted, something quiet and permanent. Because lies don't always scream, sometimes they whisper, and once you hear them, you can't unhear them. And from that day on, I started noticing things I had trained myself not to see. The way conversations changed direction when money came up, the way questions about my plans were framed as concern, the way my independence was gently questioned as if it were fragile, as if I needed to be guided towards simpler options. And every time I brushed it off, every time I laughed softly and said I was fine, I felt a strange mix of relief and discomfort. Relief because ignoring it was easier. Discomfort because part of me knew I was lying to myself. Awe, and then there were the numbers, the ones I never added up before because adding them up would have meant acknowledging a pattern, small amounts here and there, help with this, help with that, never framed as luxury, always framed as necessity, always urgent, always just enough to make questioning feel cruel. And when I finally sat down one evening and looked at it all together, my chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with money, because what I saw wasn't generosity, it was expectation, not gratitude, but reliance. And the realization that hurt the most was this: no one ever talked to me about how I would be supported, only about how I could support others. And I wondered, not angrily at first, just honestly, had they already decided I would manage on my own? Had they already written a future where I gave and gave until I had nothing left to give, and then quietly disappeared from the list of responsibilities? That thought made me feel small in a way I hadn't felt in years, because independence had always been my pride, my proof that I wasn't a burden. But suddenly it felt like something being used against me. Like my strength had become an excuse, and I kept telling myself I was overthinking, that families are complicated, that love doesn't always look neat. But the truth is, when love is healthy, it doesn't make you feel invisible. And I had started to feel invisible long before the text arrived. Invisible except for one thing: my usefulness. And the hardest part to admit, even now, is that I played along because I didn't want to lose access to my own child, to my grandchildren, to the role that gave my days meaning. And when you love someone, you don't want to believe they see you as a resource instead of a person. But love doesn't stop patterns from existing, it just makes them harder to accept. And once I saw the lie, once I felt that flicker of unease turn into something heavier, I couldn't go back to not seeing it. And every polite smile after that felt slightly off, every visit felt a little measured, every call felt like it had an unspoken purpose underneath it. And I started to understand that the text message wasn't cruelty born in a moment. It was honesty finally slipping out, honesty that had been building quietly while I was busy believing the best. And that realization hurt more than anger ever could, because anger passes, but disappointment settles deep. And as I sat alone one evening, replaying that confused look on her face, replaying his quick correction, replaying all the times I told myself not to think too hard, I felt something else rising beneath the sadness: awareness. Sharp and uncomfortable, but steady, and awareness changes things whether you want it to or not. Because once you understand that someone has already drawn a line in the future without telling you, you're forced to ask yourself a question you've avoided your whole life. If they've planned a future without me, why am I still planning mine around them? And that question didn't have an answer yet, but it was there, waiting, growing louder, and I knew, deep down, that the calm reply I had sent wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of something they hadn't prepared for, something that would make every quiet assumption suddenly very loud. People think the most powerful reactions are loud ones, shouting, crying, slamming doors, but I've learned something very different over the years. The reactions that scare people the most are calm ones. The ones that don't give them anything to push against. And after I sent that single word, after I placed my phone face down on the table and just sat there listening to the hum of the house, I realized I wasn't shaking anymore. My breathing had slowed, and instead of panic, there was a strange stillness settling inside me, sight the kind that arrives right before a decision you can't undo, and I kept replaying the message in my head, not angrily. Not even sadly anymore, but analytically, like I was studying a fact rather than a wound, and the more I did that, the clearer something became. This wasn't a threat, it was a boundary, his boundary, drawn without discussion, without care, without even a hint of responsibility. And if he was allowed to draw one so cleanly, so calmly, then so was I, and that realization didn't make me bitter, it made me focused, because for the first time, I stopped asking why he said it and started asking what it meant for me, and that shift changed everything, because when you stop centering your life around someone else's choices, you finally see your own, and my choice was simple. Even if it felt heavy, I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life pretending a future existed that clearly didn't, and I wasn't going to leave my dignity up to someone who had already opted out. Ha, the thought almost made me smile, because there was something oddly freeing about accepting the truth without fighting it, and once that acceptance settled in, the next step felt obvious, not dramatic, not emotional, just necessary. And that same afternoon, while the light outside hadn't even shifted yet, I picked up the phone again, scrolled to a number I hadn't used in a while, and made a call that felt both terrifying and steady at the same time. And when the line connected and I heard a familiar professional voice, I said, "I need to update my will," and there was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that suggests concern, but I didn't rush to explain, didn't justify myself. Because I didn't need permission to make decisions about my own life. And as I spoke, I could feel the old version of myself wanting to soften the moment, wanting to add reassurance, wanting to say it's nothing serious. But I stopped that instinct because minimizing my needs had brought me here in the first place. And for the first time, I let my words stand without apology, and when the call ended, I sat there quietly, listening to the sound of my own heartbeat, and it occurred to me that this was the first decision I had made purely for myself in a long time, maybe ever, and that realization brought a mix of emotions I hadn't expected: fear, yes, but also relief and something else that felt almost like pride, awe, because choosing yourself after years of choosing others feels unfamiliar, like wearing a new coat that doesn't quite fit yet, and as the day went on, I found myself moving through familiar routines with a different awareness, noticing how often I had shaped my life around availability, around being helpful, around being easy, and I wondered how many of my choices had been truly mine, and how many had been shaped by the quiet pressure to remain useful. And the more I thought about it, the more I understood that rewriting my will wasn't about punishment, it wasn't about revenge, it wasn't even about money. It was about alignment, about making sure my future reflected the reality I was living in, not the fantasy I had been clinging to, and that clarity felt grounding in a way emotions never could, because emotions come and go. But clarity stays, and as evening settled in, I made myself dinner, sat at the table alone, and for the first time since my husband passed, I didn't feel the usual ache of loneliness. Instead, I felt present, fully present, aware that something important had shifted, even if no one else knew it yet, and I knew, without knowing how, that this calm would not be received quietly, because people who expect control don't handle independence well. And people who assume entitlement don't respond kindly when that assumption is challenged. And as I washed the dishes and turned off the lights, a small thought crossed my mind. Almost like a warning whispered by intuition, he's going to notice. And that thought didn't scare me the way it might have before, because by then, I had already accepted something that changed the rules entirely. If he had chosen a future without responsibility, then I was finally free to choose a future without fear, and I had a feeling that when he realized what I'd done, the calm he dismissed would turn into something he couldn't control, something loud, something frantic, something he was completely unprepared for. I didn't have to wait long to find out how calm decisions feel to people who are used to control, because it turns out silence makes some people louder, and certainty makes them reckless, and the very next morning, before I had even finished my breakfast, before the house had fully woken up, I heard a sharp knock on the door, not the polite kind, not the friendly kind, but the kind that demands to be answered, and my heart jumped once hard. then settled because some part of me already knew who it was. And when I opened the door, there he stood, my son, breathing fast, eyes wide, face tight in a way I had never seen before. And for a second, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the contrast was so clear. Ha ha ha. The same person who had calmly told me not to expect care now looked like someone who had lost something important and didn't know how to get it back. And he didn't even say hello, didn't ask how I was, didn't pretend this was a visit. He just stepped forward slightly and said, "What did you do?" And the question wasn't curiosity, it was accusation, fear wrapped in anger. And I felt something inside me shift again because this wasn't concern, this was panic. And panic doesn't come from love, it comes from loss of control. And I invited him inside anyway, not because he deserved comfort, but because I wanted to see how far he would go when faced with the reality he hadn't planned for. And as soon as the door closed behind him, he started talking, words spilling out too fast, questions overlapping. Voice rising and falling, and the more he spoke, the clearer it became that my quiet decision had hit exactly where it hurt, because he wasn't asking why, he was demanding how I could make changes without telling him. How I could involve a lawyer without discussing it, how I could make decisions about family matters without his approval. And that's when it hit me, not like a blow, but like a sudden understanding. He didn't see my life as mine. He saw it as shared territory, something he had access to by default, and when I said calmly, "It's my will," I updated it. He stared at me like I had spoken a foreign language, and for the first time, he said the words out loud. The ones that had been hiding behind everything else. "You can't do that," and I almost smiled because people always reveal their true beliefs when they're afraid, and what he meant wasn't that I legally couldn't, it was that I morally shouldn't. Not without his consent, and I asked him gently, evenly, why not? And the silence that followed was loud because he didn't have an answer that didn't expose him, and when he finally spoke again, his voice softened just enough to sound reasonable, just enough to sound like concern. He said, "After everything we've done for you." And that was when I felt anger rise for the first time, not sharp, not explosive, but deep and steady. Because the phrase was backwards, completely backwards, and I realized he believed the story had already been written, that his role as a son guaranteed him future rewards without future responsibility. And when I reminded him of his message, when I repeated his own words back to him, slowly, calmly, watching his face change as recognition settled in, he tried to take them back. He said he was stressed. That he didn't mean it like that I was overreacting. But the problem with written words is that they don't disappear when people regret them. And I told him quietly, "I'm not punishing you, I'm respecting what you said." And that made him angry in a way shouting never could, because suddenly he couldn't argue without contradicting himself. And he paced the room, running his hands through his hair, muttering about fairness, about family, about expectations. And then he said something that finally removed all doubt. We were counting on that. And the room felt very still after that, like even the walls were listening, and I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not my child. Not the boy I raised, but a man who had already spent something that was never his, and I asked, counting on what? Even though I already knew the answer, and he didn't respond, because silence is the loudest confession, and in that moment, the fear I had felt the night before vanished completely, replaced by something firmer, something unmovable, because it wasn't just disappointment anymore, it was clarity, and clarity doesn't negotiate. And when he realized that guilt wasn't working, reason wasn't working, and anger wasn't working, his voice changed again, sharper this time, colder, and he said, "You're making a huge mistake," and for the first time I believed him. Not because I was wrong, but because I understood he wasn't done trying. And as he finally left, slamming the door behind him hard enough to rattle the frame, I stood there in the quiet, heart steady, hands calm, and I knew, without any doubt, that this wasn't the end of the conflict, it was the beginning of escalation, because people who feel entitled don't walk away when entitlement is challenged. They push harder, they dig deeper, and as I turned back toward the kitchen, the morning light still soft and ordinary, I felt something settle into place, a certainty that whatever came next would be louder, more aggressive, more desperate, and that I would need more than calm to face it, I would need protection. Preparation and the courage to stand firm when the pressure increased, because the calm that scares people most is the calm that refuses to move. After he left, after the echo of that door slam faded and the house returned to its usual quiet, I stood there for a long time doing nothing at all, just listening to my own breathing and feeling the weight of what had been revealed. Because once someone shows you their sense of entitlement, you can't unsee it, and pretending otherwise becomes dangerous, not just emotionally but practically too. Sigh, and that was the moment I understood something important. This wasn't just about hurt feelings or broken trust anymore. This was about safety, about making sure my life, my home. My choices couldn't be grabbed the moment someone decided I was inconvenient, and that realization didn't come with drama, it came with focus. a clear, almost cold kind of focus that surprised me. Because I had always thought fear would make me small, but instead it sharpened me, and that afternoon I started doing things I should have done years ago, not out of paranoia, but out of responsibility to myself. I gathered papers. Bank statements, old documents, everything I had scattered around because I never thought I'd need to defend my own sanity or ownership. Ha ha ha, imagine that, defending yourself from the child you raised, and as I organized things. I noticed how often I had delayed decisions because they felt uncomfortable, how often I had trusted without verifying because questioning felt unkind, and that pattern stopped right there. Because kindness without boundaries is just permission for harm, and I wasn't willing to give that permission anymore. I made phone calls, careful ones, asking questions instead of making assumptions. Learning about things I had avoided because they sounded complicated or intimidating. And the more I learned, the clearer it became that doing nothing would be the biggest mistake of all, because when someone feels entitled, they don't wait politely, they look for openings, and I could feel it in my bones that he was already thinking of his next move. And that night, lying in bed, sleep refused to come, my mind racing not with panic, but with strategy. With scenarios, with quiet what-ifs that refused to be ignored. And yes, I cried then, silently, staring at the ceiling, not because I felt weak, but because grief doesn't disappear just because clarity arrives. All grieving the child you thought you had is a special kind of pain, one that sits heavy on the chest, but even through the tears, I didn't feel lost, I felt awake, and the next morning I moved with purpose. Closing doors I had left open too long, changing things that should never have been shared, creating distance where access had been mistaken for trust, and each small action steadied me. Like placing stones across a river you're finally ready to cross, and the fear that had once whispered, "What if I'm wrong?" was replaced by a stronger question. What if I don't protect myself and regret it later? And that question had a very clear answer. So I kept going, documenting conversations, saving messages, writing dates down, not because I wanted conflict, but because I refused to be caught unprepared and as exhausting as it was. There was a strange peace in knowing I wasn't pretending anymore, I wasn't smoothing things over, I wasn't sacrificing my future for temporary comfort, and somewhere in the middle of all that seriousness, I even caught myself laughing softly. Ha 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 at how different I felt, how much lighter my chest was even with all the weight I was carrying. Because choosing yourself does that, it doesn't erase pain, but it gives it direction. And if you're listening to this right now and feeling something stir inside you, that quiet recognition that maybe you've been too understanding for too long, maybe you've been generous where you should have been firm, then let me say this gently, you're not wrong for wanting peace, but peace doesn't come from silence, it comes from protection. And if stories like this matter to you, if they make you feel less alone in the choices you're afraid to make, take a moment to subscribe, because sometimes hearing someone else choose themselves gives us permission to do the same. And as the days passed, I could sense the tension building on the other side of the silence, messages left unanswered. Calls that went to voicemail, the quiet before a storm I knew was coming, because people who lose access rarely accept it quietly. And while I stayed calm on the surface, inside I was bracing myself, strengthening resolve. Reminding myself again and again why I had started this in the first place, not to punish, not to prove anything, but to live without fear, and I didn't know exactly how far he would go next. I didn't know what shape his desperation would take, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. When someone realizes they can't control you anymore, they don't ask politely for power back, they try to take it. And I was determined that when that moment came, I wouldn't be caught doubting myself again. I thought I was prepared for whatever came next, but nothing prepares you for the moment someone uses children as leverage, because no matter how strong you feel, that kind of move goes straight past logic and hits the heart. And it happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind where the day feels slow and harmless, when I heard voices outside, high and excited, followed by footsteps I recognized instantly, and before I could even stand up, the doorbell rang. Sharp and cheerful at the same time, and when I opened the door, there they were, my grandchildren first, smiling, holding something in their hands like a gift, and behind them, my son and his wife, wearing expressions carefully chosen for the moment, concern mixed with sweetness, and my chest tightened so fast it almost stole my breath, awe because seeing those little faces erased every practiced sentence I had ready. And one of them ran forward, arms open, saying my name the way only a child does, like it's the safest word in the world. And for a split second, I wanted to pretend nothing was wrong, to hug them, invite everyone in, make tea. Return to the version of life that felt familiar, but I knew better now, and that knowledge hurt more than ignorance ever had, because I could see it clearly. This wasn't a visit, it was a tactic, and they didn't even try to hide it for long. Because once they were inside, once the children were distracted, the tone shifted, the softness dropped, and the real conversation began, framed as concern for me, for my health, for my sudden decisions. And the words came wrapped in care but sharpened underneath, suggesting I was confused, suggesting I was being influenced, suggesting I needed guidance. And as they spoke, I felt something inside me harden, not in anger, but in resolve. Because there's a moment when manipulation becomes obvious, and once it does, it loses its power. And when my son said, gently but firmly, that maybe it was time to fix this for the sake of the family, I understood exactly what he meant: restore what he believed was his. And when I refused, when I said no without raising my voice, without explaining myself again, his wife's expression changed first, the patience slipping, the warmth cooling, and that's when the line was crossed, because she said it calmly, almost casually, like it was a reasonable consequence, that if I continued down this path, it might be confusing for the children to stay connected. That sometimes distance is healthier, and my body reacted before my mind did. A rush of heat, a hollow drop in my stomach, weeping rising fast and hot behind my eyes, because threatening a mother with loneliness is cruel. But threatening a grandmother with separation is calculated, and I realized in that moment that they were willing to hurt their own children emotionally if it meant regaining control, and that realization changed something permanently. Because love doesn't make threats like that, desperation does, and I stood there, heart pounding, hands steady, and said words I never imagined I would say: that they needed to leave, that using children as weapons was unacceptable, that any further contact would happen on my terms or not at all. And the shock on their faces told me they hadn't expected resistance. They had expected collapse, tears, bargaining, guilt, something they could work with, and when none of that came, when I didn't bend, didn't chase, didn't plead, anger replaced persuasion, sharp and sudden, voices rising, accusations flying, and I remember one of the children peeking around the corner, confusion written all over their face. And that sight nearly broke me, sigh. But even then, even with my heart splitting in two, I knew backing down now would teach everyone the wrong lesson, that boundaries mean nothing if they disappear under pressure. And as they finally left, dragging disappointment and rage behind them, the house felt emptier than it ever had, not just quiet, but hollow, and I sank into a chair, shaking now, finally, the strength draining out all at once, because holding the line costs something. It always does, and I cried then, openly, deeply, not for myself, but for the innocents caught in the middle of adult greed, and as painful as it was, as cruel as it felt, I understood something that night that I had avoided my entire life. Love without limits isn't love, it's surrender, and I wasn't willing to surrender my dignity, my safety, or my future, even for people I loved. And especially not when love was being used as a weapon, because once children are brought into a fight like this, there's no pretending it's just a family disagreement anymore. It becomes something darker, something that demands consequences. And as I wiped my eyes and stared at the door long after they were gone, one thought stayed with me, heavy and unavoidable. If they were willing to go this far emotionally, what would they be willing to do next legally? And that thought didn't scare me the way it might have before, because now I understood the truth. The calm phase was over, and the real battle was just beginning. The letter arrived quietly, slipped into my mailbox like it didn't carry the weight of everything it threatened, and I remember holding it in my hands for a long moment before opening it, feeling that familiar mix of dread and resolve. Because by then I knew silence usually meant preparation, and preparation meant escalation, sigh, and as I read the words, carefully chosen and perfectly cold, suggesting evaluations, questioning judgment, hinting that maybe I wasn't fully capable of managing my own affairs, something inside me went very still, not frightened, not angry, just clear, because this was the move I had been bracing for. The one that turns family conflict into paperwork, turns love into allegations, and turns a lifetime of independence into something that suddenly needs to be proven. And I won't lie, there was a moment, just a brief one, where doubt crept in, whispering, what if this becomes bigger than I can handle? What if standing firm costs more than I imagined? But that moment passed quickly, replaced by a steadier truth. If I gave in now, if I let fear decide for me, then everything I had endured would be meaningless, and I wasn't willing to erase my own courage just to make someone else comfortable. Ha ha ha. Funny how strength often shows up only after you've already been tested. And I reached for the phone again, not in panic, not in confusion, but with intention, because this was no longer about emotion. It was about facts, and facts don't bend under pressure, and the days that followed were filled with appointments. Questions, answers, forms, conversations that felt clinical and exhausting, but also grounding, because for the first time in this entire ordeal, everything was out in the open. No guessing, no interpreting tone, no wondering what was meant. Just direct evaluation, direct scrutiny, and oddly enough, I found comfort in that, because clarity protects you when narratives are being twisted, and as I sat through long conversations, answered personal questions, solved puzzles meant to measure awareness, memory, reasoning, I realized something that almost made me smile. I wasn't fighting to prove anything new. I was simply being myself, and that was enough. And when the assessments ended, when the polite professionalism gave way to quiet certainty, I could feel it in the room, even before anything was said, that this attempt to shake me had failed. And yet, despite that reassurance, despite knowing I had nothing to hide, the emotional toll lingered because having your sanity questioned by your own child is a wound that doesn't bleed openly. It aches quietly, and at night, lying in bed. I thought about how easily love can be rewritten into suspicion when money is involved, how quickly care turns into control when entitlement feels threatened, and I wondered how many parents never see this coming. How many lose everything not because they were incapable, but because they trusted the wrong people for too long, and that thought fueled me, not with anger, but with purpose, because if my story was going to continue, it would be on my terms, grounded in truth, not fear, and when the day finally came where everything would be reviewed, where conclusions would be drawn, I walked in calm, steady, dressed neatly, holding my head high. Not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because dignity isn't something you turn on for an audience. It's something you carry when you refuse to shrink. And as I sat there, listening to others speak about me as if I weren't in the room, describing my life, my decisions, my motivations, I felt a strange detachment, like I was watching a story that no longer controlled me. And when the questions finally came directly to me, they weren't traps. They were opportunities, opportunities to speak clearly, to explain without apology, to state plainly that choosing autonomy is not confusion, that protecting yourself is not hostility, and that age does not erase intelligence. And when it was over, when the silence settled again, it wasn't the uneasy silence of before. It was a heavy, waiting silence, the kind that comes right before truth lands where it belongs. And I knew then that no matter what happened next, no matter how loudly they protested or how deeply they resented me, the attempt to break me had failed, because the moment someone tries to strip you of your voice and you keep speaking anyway, they lose more than a battle, they lose the illusion of power. And as I walked away from that chapter, heart tired but spirit steady, one thing was certain: the mask was slipping, and soon everyone would see exactly who this fight had always been about. I wish I could say that when the truth finally surfaced, it felt like victory, like relief, like some clean ending where pain turns into satisfaction. But the reality was quieter and heavier than that, because when everything was laid bare, when all the calm explanations and careful evaluations made it impossible to twist the story any further, what remained wasn't triumph, it was exposure, and exposure has a way of stripping people down to who they really are. And I saw it clearly in his face when he realized this path had reached its end, not the face of a son worried about his mother, but the face of someone watching a plan fall apart. And that realization hurt in a way no argument ever could. Sigh, because anger is loud and temporary, but disappointment settles deep and stays. And as the final words were spoken, as the tension in the room shifted from accusation to certainty, I felt something loosen inside me, not joy, but acceptance, the kind that comes when you finally stop hoping someone will become who you need them to be, and instead see who they've chosen to be. And when he looked at me then, not with concern, not with regret, but with resentment, it confirmed everything I had already understood. That this had never been about misunderstanding or stress or poor wording. It had always been about control, and control, once challenged, doesn't disappear quietly, it turns bitter, and I could feel that bitterness radiating off him. Heavy and sharp, and as people began to move on, gathering papers, lowering voices, ending what had become a very clear conclusion, he didn't say goodbye, didn't soften, didn't even pretend. He just stared at me like I had taken something from him, and in a way, I had not money, not property, but certainty, the certainty that life would unfold exactly the way he expected it to. And as I walked away, my legs steady even though my chest felt hollow, I realized something painful and freeing at the same time. You can raise someone with love, patience, and sacrifice and still lose them, not to distance or time, but to entitlement. And that loss feels strange because the person is still alive, still breathing, still walking around in the world. Yet the relationship you thought you had is gone, and grief without a funeral is a lonely thing. There are no casseroles, no condolences, no rituals for mourning the living, just quiet days where you adjust to an absence that no one else can see. And that night, alone in my house, I sat in the dark longer than usual, not crying, not thinking, just feeling the weight of what had ended, because even when you know you did the right thing, doing the right thing can still hurt, and I let myself feel that hurt fully, without judgment, without rushing to justify it. Because pretending you're unaffected only pushes pain deeper, and I didn't want to carry this into whatever came next. And as the days passed, the silence grew, no calls, no messages, no attempts to negotiate, just a clean, sharp distance. And at first it felt cruel, like abandonment all over again. But slowly, very slowly, it began to feel honest. Because relationships built on expectation don't survive boundaries, and that truth, once accepted, brings a strange peace. And I found myself breathing easier, sleeping better, laughing occasionally at small things again. Ha ha ha, because emotional weight lifts even when emotional loss remains. And one afternoon, while walking through my neighborhood, I caught myself smiling at nothing in particular, and that startled me because it meant life was continuing, not despite the pain, but alongside it. And I understood then that closure doesn't come from apologies or reconciliations. It comes from alignment, from knowing your actions match your values. And while I would always carry sadness for the son I thought I had, I no longer carried guilt for protecting myself, and that distinction changed everything. Because guilt keeps you stuck, but clarity lets you move forward. And as I looked ahead, not knowing exactly what the future would bring but feeling steadier than I had in years, I knew this story wasn't ending in bitterness. It was ending in truth, and truth, even when it costs you relationships, is lighter to carry than lies. And with that realization settling deep in my chest, I understood something important. What comes next isn't about what I lost. It's about what I'm finally free to build. What surprised me most after everything settled wasn't how empty my life became, but how full it quietly started to feel. Because when you stop living in constant tension, waiting for the next demand or disappointment, space opens up in ways you don't expect, and at first that space felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, like a quiet room after years of noise, sigh, but slowly, gently, it began to feel like peace. And my days started to reshape themselves without effort. Mornings where I woke up without dread, afternoons where I moved at my own pace, evenings where the silence felt restful instead of lonely. And I noticed changes in my body too: deeper sleep, steadier breathing, laughter returning in small, surprising moments. Ha ha ha, the kind that slips out when you least expect it. And I realized how much emotional weight I had been carrying without naming it. The constant effort to stay agreeable, helpful, available, afraid of rocking the boat. And once that effort stopped, I had energy again. Energy to reconnect with parts of myself I had set aside years ago. I went back to long walks, to reading without interruption, to conversations that didn't revolve around obligation. And I found community in places I hadn't looked before: friends who listened without asking for anything in return, people who valued my presence, not my usefulness, and that shift healed something deep inside me. All because it reminded me that worth isn't something you earn by giving endlessly, it's something you have simply by existing. And over time, joy returned in ways that felt earned, not forced: volunteering, learning, creating, filling my days with purpose that didn't come with conditions. And even the love I carried for my grandchildren changed shape: quieter, steadier, patient, no longer tangled in fear. Because I trusted that life would find a way to reconnect us when the time was right. And if it didn't, I knew I had still chosen the healthiest path available to me, and that knowledge brought a calm confidence I had never known before. The kind that doesn't need validation. And looking back now, I understand that the message I received that morning wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment my story finally became mine. The moment I stopped shrinking myself to fit someone else's expectations and started honoring my own life, my own dignity, my own future. And if there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's this: loving someone does not require losing yourself, and boundaries are not cruelty. They are clarity, and choosing peace over manipulation is not selfish, it's survival. And if you're listening to this and feeling that quiet ache of recognition, like maybe you've been holding on too tightly to something that's hurting you, know that it's okay to choose yourself. It's okay to step back. It's okay to protect what you've built, because the right people will respect you more for it, not less. And if this story meant something to you, if it helped you feel less alone or a little stronger in your own choices, take a moment to subscribe for more stories like this, because sometimes hearing someone else choose dignity gives us the courage to do the same. And as I move forward now, steady and unafraid, I carry no bitterness, only understanding. And that understanding has given me the greatest gift of all: a life lived on my own terms, with peace in my heart and no apology for it.